I didn't learn I had cancer from a dramatic collapse or a midnight ambulance. It arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning as a letter that smelled faintly of printer ink and bad news. Stage 2. Aggressive, begin treatment immediately. I read the words at my kitchen table, the same table where my son David had eaten cereal while cramming for algebra, and felt the floor of my life shift half an inch. I had a plan, though. I had savings set aside for years from my late husband's life insurance, a tidy lifeboat marked emergency. This was an emergency. I called David. He sounded distracted but supportive, as if reassurance were something he could tap out while answering another message. "We'll start next week," I said. I thought that promise was a door opening. I didn't realize it was about to slam. 3 weeks later, I stood at my bank counter and stared at a number that didn't make sense: $347.22. The account should have read $15,347.22. The teller, a young woman with careful eyes, confirmed a single large transfer had gone out the day I'd phoned David. Authorized person, she said, meaning my son, whom I had added to the account after his father died, because widows learn early to put safety rails on the steep places. I left with the printout trembling in my hand, like a thin, accusing flag. David was at my house with his fiancée, Milani, glossy hair, green eyes, a smile that slid into rooms like a hostess surrounded by wedding invitations. Ivory cardstock scattered across my coffee table, as if an expensive tree had shed its leaves indoors. "The money's gone," I said. David's face drained. "Milani's didn't move at all." "We only borrowed it," she said, as if borrowing included no asking and no returning. "Borrowed when chemotherapy was scheduled to begin in days." David spoke quickly, promising we would figure things out, that the venue and the dress were locked in, that you only get one wedding. I looked at my son and saw the boy who had once run to me with scraped knees, now speaking grown-up words that sounded like sales pitches for another person's fairy tale. "Get out," I told them, before I broke in a place I couldn't fix. The humiliation came quiet and practical. I told the oncologist I would pay somehow. He suggested a less aggressive plan. The receptionist's smile was polite, thinner. I sold my wedding ring to a pawn shop where the man weighed love on a small metal scale. I sold my car and learned the bus route to the infusion center. On my first day, I watched other patients arrive with people who brought blankets and stayed. A nurse named Rita tucked a warm throw around me and asked who was picking me up. I told her I had it handled. I did not say that a house can be full of your memories and still feel like no one lives there. David called sometimes the way you check the weather in a city you left. His voice was warm but distant, Milani laughing somewhere behind him about centerpieces and head counts. He asked about my treatment, then about the guest list. I answered until the questions felt like someone had swapped my IV with a drip of small, tidy insults. At the grocery store, I ran into Milani glowing with the confidence of a woman who believes life will always roll out a white runner at her feet. "Geneva, how are you?" she asked sweetly, clocking the scarf over my bare scalp. "You look a little pale." She called my resilience admirable and pushed a cart filled with pricey comfort. The worst day in those first weeks arrived disguised as an ordinary one. From my infusion chair, I heard Milani's voice carry cheerfully from the waiting area as she told someone that I had minor medical stuff, that I was making the wedding about me, that at 63 I had lived my dreams, and it was her turn. I stared at the IV tubing and thought about the audacity it takes to reframe someone else's life as a footnote to your party. That afternoon, I climbed creaking stairs above a dry cleaner to the office of a private investigator named Marcus Webb. He was a man with a forgettable face and a leather notebook which felt reassuring. You want your detective to be the sort of person an elevator instantly forgets. I slid him a check scraped from selling my grandmother's china and asked him to look into Milani. "What do you want to know?" he asked. Everything I said, and surprised myself with how steady I sounded. He warned me it would take time and money. I told him I had less of one and not much of the other. He nodded as if he'd heard this exchange 100 times and started anyway. The truth didn't arrive from Marcus first. It came from a woman with competent hands and steel gray hair, who stopped me in Dr. Morrison's waiting room because she recognized my last name. Nancy Rodriguez, a nurse from another hospital, asked me to meet for coffee after my blood work. At the cafe, she told me about a young man with a brain tumor named Trevor Collins, about his beautiful wife back then called Michelle, with black hair and green eyes, about a wedding where hope dressed grief in white. She showed me a photo. Milani younger, but unmistakable. Married 8 months, she said gently, then gone when the money was gone. There was more whispers of another move, another sick man, a pattern that looked less like bad luck and more like choreography. "Tell your son," Nancy urged. "He won't believe me," I said, and we both knew why. I called Marcus and told him to dig everywhere, pull marriage records, divorce decrees, financial footprints, social posts, any trail she had left while reinventing herself into my family. He quoted a number that made my stomach clench. The next morning, I opened my jewelry box and lifted out the only thing left of real value, my mother's diamond necklace. She had given it to me on my wedding day, with instructions to pass it to my daughter-in-law. I carried it to the same pawn shop and traded yesterday's blessing for today's battle. When Marcus phoned 5 days later and asked me to come in, his voice had a weight that made my palms go cold. "Bring a pen," he said. "You'll want to take notes." Marcus's office smelled faintly of starch and old paper, the kind of scent that makes honesty feel heavier. He spread documents across his desk like he was dealing a losing hand and wanted me to see every card. 4 marriages, he said, calmly tapping dates and signatures, the ink marching across states like a road map of reinvention. First to a young man named Bradley fighting testicular cancer, brief and intense, until his treatment fund evaporated. Then Trevor Collins, the one Nancy remembered, whose obituary showed Milani, then Michelle standing at a casket with a face arranged into dignified sorrow. After that, Robert in Phoenix with a wealthy family and a lung like a collapsing tent, and finally Frank in Denver, a widower with prostate cancer and a life insurance policy that seemed to interest his new wife more than his pulse. He slid a report to me and let me read the part about dosages and medication schedules, and a nephew who noticed that Frank worsened on weeks Milani visited. Frank had lived because suspicion arrived in time. Others had not been so lucky. Marcus kept talking, but the air in the room flickered, and for a moment I thought I might float away from my chair. When the sound returned, I heard myself say, "I'll need copies of everything." The stack he handed over felt like a new kind of chemotherapy designed to kill illusions instead of cells. I went home and stared at it until the clock reached 6 p.m., then called David and asked if I could stop by. He agreed, his voice pitched higher than usual, like someone bracing for weather. At 7 p.m., I sat on his couch and laid a marriage certificate in front of him. He picked it up with shaking hands, the way people lift a fragile heirloom they never knew they owned. "That cannot be real," he said. I placed a second document beside the first, then the photograph from Trevor's obituary, then a bank statement that recorded a harvest of withdrawals, like a neat, brutal math problem. He paced to the window and back, insisting that names repeat, that clerks make mistakes, that grief misremembers faces. I told him we could call county clerks in the morning. We could verify every line. He stared at the photo and said quietly that Milani had told him he was her first real love. "Then why did she tell you she had never been married?" I asked if the truth was harmless. He called her at 7:40 p.m., asking her to come over. I wanted to snatch the phone from his hand. I wanted to stall the confrontation until I could wrap him in better armor. But 20 minutes later, Milani arrived, sundress, skimming the doorframe like a commercial for summer. She kissed David and greeted me softly, the kind of softness that always contains a blade. When David asked about her past, I watched a switch flip behind her eyes. She denied, then pivoted to confession, shaped like sympathy, a story about being young and terrified about failing someone she'd married for reasons she didn't fully understand. If all I had was Trevor, I might have forgone the breath it takes to argue. But I laid the Phoenix documents on the table, and then the Denver file, and the way Milani's mouth tightened told me I had finally spoken in a language she understood. She called me cruel. She called me jealous. She called me a sick woman twisting facts to keep a son leashed to a hospital bracelet. What struck me most was not her lie, but the confidence in it, the way she recited a version of our conversations that had never happened and watched David's doubt move molecule by molecule toward her gravity. He asked her point blank whether she had been married before. She paused, then admitted to mistakes without naming them, sketched hardship without being specific, and reached for his hand. Desperation makes brilliant theater. He wanted to believe her to open a door where both his love and his mother could fit. When I mentioned Frank Morrison by name, her gaze snapped to mine with a flare of pure calculation. She gathered her purse, declared the discussion abusive, and walked out, tossing a final sentence over her shoulder about how destroying his marriage would not cure my cancer. The door closed, as if it had decided for us to be enemies. For 3 weeks, silence moved into the space where conversation should live. I finished my treatment cycle, survived the worst days with Rita's quiet care, and a bracelet she gave me, a small silver butterfly that made my wrist feel like a promise. Then an invitation arrived by courier heavy paper with gold letters announcing a wedding that had already devoured my savings. Inside was a note in David's handwriting asking me to come. No apology, no defense, just the request every mother waits to hear from a child: I still want you there. I wrote yes, partly for him and partly because a new resolve had taken root like a stubborn plant in hard soil. I would not shout in a lobby or hurl accusations across a dance floor. But I would not let the bride glide into her next life unchallenged. In the days before the ceremony, I made calls. County clerks confirmed records while coffee cooled on my counter. A former neighbor in Phoenix told me about a moving truck that arrived at 6 a.m. and left by noon the day Robert's money ran out. Marcus found a current number for Frank, whose voice on the phone sounded tired but sharp. He had a nephew, a detective, who had been gathering evidence and could fly in if needed. Frank agreed to meet David to show him medical logs and financial withdrawals, and a small recording captured on a cheap device where Milani honey-voiced asked a man barely awake to clarify how his will allocated certain accounts. We set the meeting for 5 p.m. on a weekday when Milani believed David was at fittings. I told my son only that someone who knew the truth wanted to talk. He almost didn't come. Love keeps us from the edges even when the view could save our lives. The wedding day was bright and merciless. I arrived on time, hair still just a gray shadow navy dress hanging on a smaller frame. The country club gleamed all white roses and chandeliers, a palace you rent by the hour, to prove that your happiness has budget and taste. I sat near the back and watched David's smile miss his eyes. I watched Milani glide down the aisle in lace that looked like it had been fed on my sacrifices. During the reception, I asked her for a moment alone and showed her a single photo of herself by Frank's hospital bed while he signed papers. For the first time, her certainty thinned. I told her Frank would speak to David. I suggested she disappear before the past walked into the room wearing her history like a name tag. She laughed and told me I would lose my son if I shattered his dream. Perhaps I said, but he would be alive to hate me. We returned to the music, smiling like diplomats who had just agreed to a war. The confrontation I feared arrived not with shouting, but with a phone call at 3 a.m. David's voice shook through the receiver. "Mom, I need you to come over." By then, Frank had already visited him once, carrying documents, medical records, and a recording that made manipulations sound like lullabies. Milani had slipped out before dawn, leaving behind empty hangars and bank withdrawals timed like footsteps. When I walked into David's apartment, he sat hunched among papers, grief scattered across his coffee table. "She's gone," he said flatly. I told him I was sorry, and he laughed bitterly, accusing me of orchestrating her disappearance, as if my cancer treatments had included a side dose of criminal strategy. But when he lifted Frank's medical files, when he listened again to the recording of Milani urging a man under heavy medication to discuss his will, his face cracked open with horror. "She almost killed him," he whispered. "And if I'd gotten sick, she would have done the same to me." He cried then a sound like a boy lost in a store, and I held him as if the years had collapsed into one long moment. He said he had abandoned me when I needed him most, that he had chosen a stranger's dream dress over my life. I told him love wasn't conditional on flawless behavior. I loved him because he was mine, not because he was perfect. Forgiveness, I explained, doesn't erase wrongs, it plants a chance to grow differently. His tears slowed. "What do I do now?" he asked. "You help stop her," I said. "You protect others the way I tried to protect you." In the weeks that followed, we sat at long tables with Detective Morrison, Frank's nephew, who spread files like a general planning a campaign. There were bank accounts opened under false names, marriage certificates linking Milani to 6 men in 8 years, insurance policies altered under suspicious circumstances. 2 husbands were already dead, their families left with questions, but little proof until now. David added his testimony about the missing $15,000, the manipulation, the lies. For the first time, he seemed to understand the difference between loyalty and blindness. "She started working on the estrangement early," the detective said. "It's part of the pattern, isolating her target from anyone who might challenge her story." David nodded, silent, his shame heavy, but transforming into something useful. 3 months later, Milani was arrested in Miami, found cultivating another widower recovering from heart surgery. Watching her on the news, handcuffed but still composed, I expected triumph. Instead, I felt an exhaustion so deep it seemed to reach the marrow. "It's over," David said beside me. "This part is over," I replied. "Healing takes longer." He moved back into my house temporarily, his old bedroom filled with boxes and half-finished thoughts. We learned to navigate new rhythms, me in remission, but weak him untangling shame in therapy sessions. Some nights, he sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing, asking how he could ever trust again. I told him real love makes you more yourself, not less. If someone demands you shrink-cut ties or silence doubts, it isn't love, it's control. He listened, his expression somber, but opened the way a man listens when he knows ignorance almost cost him his life. By autumn, I was declared cancer-free. Dr. Morrison smiled with relief and told me I was tougher than statistics predicted. In the garden at home, David and I planted roses that bloomed scarlet against fading light. He confessed that he still thought about Milani, about how thoroughly he had believed her performance. I reminded him that predators craft masks convincing enough to fool almost anyone. The trick isn't to erase the past, but to carry its lessons forward. He began volunteering with a group that educates people about financial scams and emotional exploitation, using his pain as a warning beacon. He told me he couldn't undo the harm he had caused me, but hoped to prevent others from falling. "That's more than enough," I said, and meant it. Sometimes I think of Milani in prison, likely sketching her next role, rehearsing a new version of innocence for when the doors open again. I don't hate her anymore. Hate is a leash, and I've cut mine. What I carry instead is knowledge that strength blooms in unlikely soil, that survival is more than breath, and that family ties frayed and nearly severed can be stitched if both sides are willing to bleed a little thread. David betrayed me once, but he returned with honesty and repentance, and that choice matters more than the mistake. I fought cancer, but I also fought despair, and both battles left me different, harder, clearer, but also more open to the fragile courage it takes to forgive. Life doesn't hand us neat resolutions. It hands us wounds and asks what we will build from the scar tissue. I built peace, not the quiet of surrender, but the peace of knowing I can endure storms meant to break me. If you've listened this far, I hope you take with you one truth: you are stronger than the people who underestimate you, even when those people share your blood. And sometimes saving someone means standing in their way until they learn to stand with you. Thank you for walking through my story. If it touched you, please like, share, and subscribe for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far these lessons travel.